Just last year, the U.S. and the Taliban signed what was called at the time a landmark agreement in Doha, and under that pact, American forces agreed to withdraw if the Taliban entered into peace talks with the Afghan government. Now, that clearly hasn't happened. What went wrong with these talks?
There are a number of factors, I think, but prime among them is I think that the Taliban themselves were never particularly set on achieving their goal, which was control of Afghanistan through the peace talks. The peace talks were a sideshow to what they were doing inside the country, in other words, the insurgency, which was becoming increasingly successful. And the more successful it became, the less was the need, as far as they were concerned, to make concessions to the Afghan government. From the other side, President Ashraf Ghani was regarded as a difficult negotiator. He didn't enjoy the role of negotiating with the Taliban. It was something he entered into reluctantly. He was an irascible negotiator as well. And the relationship between him and the Afghan leadership was always a difficult one. I think those are the two key factors undermining the progress. But the most important, undoubtedly, the fact that for the Taliban, what they were achieving on the ground was much more important than what they were ever likely to achieve in the talks in Doha.
So the Taliban were already having progress on the ground, as you just said. How has this been building up in recent years, the Taliban's progress on the ground in Afghanistan, as you said?
Well, for a while, incrementally, we saw the Taliban taking control of provinces, particularly around in the south, around Helmand. But occasionally, too, they would take provinces where before they'd not been particularly successful, like Kunduz, for instance, which they took on 2 occasions in the past, so they were very quickly forced out. They had success along the east of the country, but gradually those successes and the failure of the government to push them out effectively meant that their traction inside the country grew stronger and stronger, to the point where over the last year we've seen what was a sort of an incremental progress turn into the role that we've seen over the last few months, where they simply became unstoppable.
So a lot of people have been pointing recently to the failure of the Afghan military to prevent this lightning offensive from the Taliban. But as you just said, it seems that these failures have been occurring for years now. What are the systemic issues at play here?
Yeah, the failures have been there right from the beginning. And I suppose the big question is, is it really possible, to create in Afghanistan, was it really possible to create in Afghanistan a modern, effective army along the lines of the sort that the United States and others, NATO, had hoped that it would be possible to create in a country where illiteracy, apart from anything else, is massively high. How do you create massive, effective soldiers who need to understand modern technologies, given that sort of raw material? Very, very difficult. Add into the equation corruption on a pretty massive scale, poor leadership at various different levels in the armed forces, but particularly at the very top. I think the Americans and others did manage to create a sort of middle-level officer corps that was quite effective, but higher than that, they failed significantly. Those are the main factors. It's not that there weren't enough men. The Afghan army, even until the last few days, was 3 times as strong as the Taliban, over 300,000 men at arms. It wasn't the equipment. They had fantastic equipment, the best equipment you can possibly buy. But the leadership was clearly a problem, and also, it has to be said, lack of morale. The Afghan army, like the police force as well, did not really buy into this concept of a modern, democratic Afghanistan. They felt that they weren't the beneficiaries of this apparent democracy that they were being told about. When it came to lives in the provinces, there was corruption. Justice was very slowly meted out. Often when it was meted out, it was unjustly carried out. So there was a lot of frustration with the state as well. And if you put all those factors together, you have ultimately what we've just seen over the last few weeks.
And if we look at it from the U.S. side, what went wrong there in terms of policy?
Well, what I've just been saying, I think, probably there was not a great deal that they could have done that would have significantly changed the picture in the long run, unless they had dealt with the overriding problems of corruption. But very difficult to do. You cannot persuade Afghans or force Afghans to change their political structures. In what is, although it's a long time in terms of US policy, 20 years, but in terms of political education, changing the political culture of a country, it's not a very long time at all. So I think one can argue that once they got past the initial stage of the operation, defeating al-Qaeda, that after that, the challenge was simply too great. It was impossible to modernize Afghanistan and turn it into a modern democratic society when the population at large was largely illiterate, not buying into the idea, apart from the intellectuals in the major cities like Kandahar and Kabul, Herat and others. The vast bulk of the population was poor, illiterate, and not buying into it. An almost impossible task for the US.
So the nation-building mission after the initial mission of diminishing al-Qaeda's capacities was flawed.
Absolutely flawed. You know, the question should have been asked at the beginning whether or not it was possible. And I think looking back, you know, with the benefit of hindsight, Congress, when it comes to look at what went wrong in Afghanistan, will consider that as one of the key issues, that how do you nation build unless the nation itself is buying into the concept, and unless all the players, the major players, are buying into the concept and not trying to line their own pockets. Often that was the case. Not always. There were many good people in Afghanistan who were acting in the interests of the country and wanted to democratize the country, but ultimately the failure lay in what I think is an almost impossible task.
And let's take a look now at the geopolitical ramifications of this Taliban takeover. China has said it's ready to have friendly ties with Afghanistan. Russia says it will consider recognizing the Taliban based on its conduct. Tell us more about that.
Well, you know, Russia has got, like China, but Russia in particular has a long-standing interest in Afghanistan, dating back not just to the 1980s with the long Afghan war, which cost the Soviet Union an awful lot, but right back into the 19th century as well. It is important for Russia. Russia has strong relationships with the Central Asian countries like Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, which border Afghanistan. The last thing it wants on those borders is instability, which could ultimately lead to instability on Russia's borders with those Central Asian states. So it's very keen to ensure that there is stability as soon as possible in Afghanistan. And if that means dealing with the Taliban, then so be it. That's what they will do. And they will be hoping, they've already been in negotiations with Taliban leaders, and they will have made it clear, I'm sure, that their main interest is stability and to make sure that the conflict doesn't spread across the borders, that for instance, drug smuggling, which is something that the Taliban have been very active in with opium and heroin in its own funding operations over the last couple of decades, is kept to an absolute minimum, does not cross the border into Central Asia and into Russia. From the point of view of China, they also are very keen to keep things under control. China has a small but porous border with Afghanistan. It's about 74 kilometers long, rugged mountain terrain. But the Chinese are concerned that there may be an export of the Taliban ideology into China, into the Uyghur areas. The Chinese have a lot of concerns about the spread of jihadism in Xinjiang province. They are clearly trying to put the lid on any possible spread of what's been happening in Afghanistan into China. They're saying they're happy to talk to the Afghan leadership. For its part, the Afghan leadership has said to the Chinese, look, we're happy to have a good relationship with you. They're thinking further down the road, you know, the country economically is in a terrible position at the moment. They need Chinese economic investment, Chinese economic support. The last thing they want to do at the moment is antagonize the Chinese.
Yes, and so we've just pulled up this map so our viewers can see better here, you know, the small border Afghanistan shares with China and the Central Asian countries. And
you see the tiny border here that Afghanistan has with China.
All right. Well, thank you so much for that analysis. Rob Parsons, France 24's Chief Foreign Editor.